Hi, Hotties. Welcome back to Hoops for Hotties, the one and only sports show for the girls, the gays, the days, and the straight men who don't admit they don't know anything about sports. And today I'm going to be taking you through a very action-packed story, and that is the career of Chris Paul. Now, Chris Paul is a very polarizing NBA figure. When I found out from my brother, who was a Chris Paul hater, he's reformed now, but that Chris Paul kind of sucked, I was shocked because Chris Paul has this family man State Farm commercial image, and he's been voted multiple times to be the president of the NBA Players Association, which means that the players in the league are voting on Chris Paul to be the person that represents them in conversations against the NBA that negotiate how much they're getting paid, negotiate their revenue share with the league, negotiate their retirement, negotiate their health care. Like, they're putting Chris Paul as the player representative, the president, at the head of negotiating that for them, and half of them hate his guts. I mean, we've had players that were teammates with him come out and say he's a bad teammate. While I was researching for this video and taking very detailed notes on Chris Paul, I saw Matt Barnes saying, he played with Chris Paul, and Chris Paul is a tough one. He says what's on his mind, and he doesn't say it in a way that you would feel comfortable saying it. He says it in the way that he wants to say it. And that can be very difficult for younger players, particularly, to deal with, and older players that are like, hey, yo, why are you talking to me like that? But this has been a theme throughout Chris Paul's career in life. And I think part of the reason why he's such a dickhead and why he punches people and gets into little spats with people, I mean, there was that one video of him telling on a player for having his shirt untucked to the ref so that he got a tech. Like, he just does little dirty stuff like that. But this is all a part of a larger villain origin story that Chris Paul has around being the small guy. Starts when Chris Paul was just a youngin', and he was class president, a natural born leader, which is fitting for the guy who's been elected NBA Players Association president multiple times. It's who he is. He is a leader. It has gotten him into trouble sometimes, but it's also been a very cornerstone piece to his basketball career. And he needed to be a big vocal leader because he was only 5'1". And when he was in high school and he told his friends that he wanted to try out for the basketball team, they made fun of him. They were like, you're 5'1". Basketball? Why don't you try soccer? I mean, I don't know if that's what they said, but that's what I would have said. But even though his friends were making fun of him for wanting to try out for the basketball team, his grandfather, who was his role model, believed in him. And he ended up making the JV team, which everybody really wants to make varsity. It's kind of like getting cut, but this ended up being a blessing in disguise for Chris Paul because he got to play 30 minutes a game. This is such an important message for how sports connects with the deeper themes of life and why I think it's so important for people to be involved in and play sports. It builds so much character to have a moment like wanting to make the varsity basketball team and getting denied that blessing and making the JV team and being knocked down a little bit, being humbled a little bit, but getting the opportunity to play because you weren't on varsity sitting on the bench for an older kid. You were on JV. And so Chris Paul got to hone in on his skills and really learn the game. Then he hits a growth spurt and shoots up to 5'10". A 9-inch growth spurt. I know that was like aching to the body. Things were really picking up for Chris Paul's basketball career, but unfortunately in his personal life, his grandfather was putting groceries in his car when some kids tried to come and rob him, and they beat him to death. His grandfather passed away in that way. How heartbreaking. And for that to be his role model and the person who believed in him to even go try out for this basketball thing in the first place I can't imagine how traumatic that is. This is one of the greatest sports stories I have ever heard in my life. Chris Paul, after his grandfather passed away, who was his role model at 61 years old, he was not the player to go out and score a bunch like a Kobe or MJ. That has never been Chris Paul's game. He has led the league in assists years and years and years and years and years. He is the guy to get his teammates the ball. He is the guy, you put him on your team, he makes his teammates better. However, when he played in a basketball game after losing his grandfather, he made it his mission to score 61 points in honor of his grandfather. Now, as a guy who doesn't score a lot, that is really tough to do, and that is a lot of points. He goes out on that floor and goes nuts. He is not the Chris Paul that we are used to seeing that is facilitating the offense, getting his teammates the ball. He is looking to score. And when he scores his 61st point in that game, he was fouled by another player. And so he got to shoot a free throw. Instead of shooting that free throw and making that basket, he just straight up threw the ball straight ahead, just threw it, throwing away his opportunity to make that last 60-second point because he only wanted that 61 to honor his grandfather's life. He was checked out of the game. He goes onto the bench, bawls his eyes out, and has a really emotional moment and sits for the rest of the game. Now, the publicity from what might have been one of the most traumatic and horrible moments of his life propelled him to be named North Carolina's Mr. Basketball. And he ended up getting offers from a bunch of major universities and chose to stay near home and go to Wake Forest. He plays with LeBron James in the McDonald's All-American game, and his stock is just skyrocketing. And then he gets to Wake Forest. His freshman year, things were good. They made the tournament and lost. His sophomore year, he punched an opponent and ended up getting suspended for one game of the ACC tournament. And his teammates said, look, that is the duality you get with Chris Paul. I'm paraphrasing here, but he is a really strong and good competitor, but that can also kind of be the thing that makes him an asshole. That is definitely foreshadowing to his NBA career. Everyone says that about him. He wanted to stay in college. However, when he found out that he could go to the NBA, be a top 5 pick and a millionaire and change his family's life, he was like, fuck college. Isn't that crazy how nowadays college kids can be millionaires? That's neither here nor there. Now, the one flaw in Chris Paul's game, even though he was incredibly skilled and his basketball IQ was incredibly high, was his height. He's a little guy, 5'11", regular dude, going up to play against 6'8", 7-foot superhumans. But in 2005, Chris Paul had his name called by the late, great David Stern, and he was drafted to the NBA to the New Orleans Hornets. I stuttered a little bit because I was going to call them the Charlotte Hornets because that's what they are now. The New Orleans Hornets just sounds wrong. And even though there were doubts about his height, he was the Western Conference Player of the Month every single month of his rookie year, and he was almost named unanimous Rookie of the Year, but one voter chose somebody else. If he was Rookie of the Month every single month, I mean, it was obviously going to be him. Who the hell did that? What a hater. He led the Hornets to their first playoff series win in history, and he had some very interesting moments in the playoffs, including playing the Spurs with 3 Hall of Famers, but being the best player in that series and losing to them in a Game 7. He won gold with the Redeem team. Chris Paul was never a scorer, but he was excellent. He even finished second in MVP voting one time to Kobe Bryant. And even though he had like Magic Johnson numbers when he won his MVPs, even though Chris Paul was a better defender, but I'm not here to debate about that. He couldn't win the MVP award because his team simply was not good. The Hornets sucked. Wow, a statement that was true back in the early 2000s and still is true right now. Then in 2010, he was injured, and when he came back the next year, they lost to the defending champion Lakers in their prime. So after losing in the playoffs to the Lakers, it was clear that it was time for Chris Paul to go. The problem with the Hornets is that they weren't bad, and because they had a player like Chris Paul, they were good enough to get to the playoffs, but not good enough to go far, but they also weren't bad enough to get a high draft pick. And the interesting thing is, at the time, the NBA owned the Hornets. So I don't even know if that's allowed anymore, but yeah, the NBA were the owners of the Charlotte New Orleans Hornets. And they decided that they should trade Chris Paul before he just left them in free agency for nothing. At least if they traded him, they could get something in return. And so they traded him to the Los Angeles Lakers to pair him up with Kobe Bryant and be one of the greatest backcourts the NBA has ever seen. I'm saying that because the NBA has now seen Steph Curry and Klay Thompson, and they hadn't seen them yet. That's neither here nor there. Now, the interesting part is the NBA, who owned the Hornets, vetoed the trade, which means that David Stern, who was the commissioner of the NBA at the time, who got to make all the decisions for the Hornets because he was the owner, basically, said, no, we're not trading Chris Paul to the Lakers. A lot of people consider this to be really controversial and one of the worst moments of Chris Paul's career because I mean, had he been paired up with Kobe, could he have won a championship? One of the interesting things is trading Chris Paul to the Lakers would make them lose Pau Gasol and Lamar Odom. And Lamar Odom would go and play in Charlotte. And that was a better deal for the Lakers than the original deal. The three teams involved were the Los Angeles Lakers, I believe the Houston Rockets, and the Charlotte, New Orleans Hornets. Okay. And the trade, rather, was a win 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 for everybody involved. They would have been better off trading Chris Paul to LA and getting what they would have gotten from LA, the Lakers, if they would have just let the trade go through. Now, the interesting thing is the reason David Stern didn't want Chris Paul to go to the Lakers and get a better offer is because they wanted to sell the team. They wanted to sell the Hornets, and it would be less attractive to sell a mediocre basketball team that wasn't good enough to win the finals, but wasn't bad enough to get a high draft pick and have a good, promising future. That isn't worth as much as, a team that's at the bottom of the barrel or at the top of the barrel. And so they didn't want to get the best offer out of this trade that could make them better. They wanted to either tank or win a championship. And since winning the championship was out of the cards, trading Chris Paul to LA for a decent package and a decent team also wasn't in the cards. David Stern feared the trade would keep them mediocre, and so they ended up trading him to the Clippers for a worse deal in hopes of earning a higher draft pick by being shitty. At least Chris Paul got to go to LA. It just wasn't to the Lakers to be with Kobe. However, he was still getting a good shake. They paired him up with one of the best young forwards in the whole league at the time, and that was Blake Griffin and DeAndre Jordan. And this created the Lob City Clippers. Because he had some guys on the team that could really dunk, and Chris Paul was so good at passing his teammates the ball, he was able to set them up for some really incredible dunks. And so people loved the Lob City Clippers because he was constantly throwing them alley-oops for some crazy dunks. One thing you can't say about Chris Paul is when he goes somewhere, he doesn't make his teammates better, because everywhere he went, he made his teammates electric and much better. Chris Paul ended up finishing third in MVP voting to Kevin Durant and LeBron James, but they ended up losing in the second round of the playoffs to the Spurs, and then they lost the next year in the first round of the playoffs to the Grizzlies. So they did what all NBA teams do when they can't get over the hump. They fired their coach and they hired Doc Rivers, and this instantly made them championship contenders. They surrounded Chris Paul and the Lob City guys with shooters. Doc Rivers was making DeAndre Jordan into a starter, playing around 30 minutes a game. Chris Paul was leading the league in assists and steals. And they beat their franchise win record that they beat the previous year by one game by winning 57 games. So they were getting better. And having two talented big guys, Chris Paul to facilitate the offense, surrounded by a bunch of shooters like JJ Redick and others, they were pretty set up. However, in the middle of their first round playoff series against the Golden State Warriors, one of the biggest scandals in Clippers history hit. Their owner, I believe his name was Donald Sterling, but Mr. Sterling, was caught being racist. And this wasn't like today, where we're catching somebody in some old racist tweets. No. They got his voice saying derogatory things about Black people. And disgusting, really bad things about Black people. The players considered boycotting their playoff game against the Warriors and ended up not doing that because they were like, to hell with that. Boycotting racism, possibly being able to win the championship. Sorry, I gotta put me first. They ended up beating the Golden State Warriors in 7 games and then going on to face Oklahoma City with Russell Westbrook. No. This was the Russell Westbrook and KD era in OKC. Real ones know. They were tied 2-2 with OKC, and Chris Paul choked in the playoffs. And royally choked. It was all his fault. The Thunder beat them. The Clippers choked again. Chris Paul got hurt. There were untimely injuries. It was a mess. And then the chemistry started getting all fucked up between Blake Griffin and Chris Paul. Chris Paul ended up getting traded to Houston, where he would be paired up with James Harden, and nobody knew if they would mesh because they both like to have the ball, but boy, did they mesh, and it looked like they'd play together for years. And James Harden ended up winning the MVP. You remember what I said about Chris Paul making the people around him better? This Rockets team that had Chris Paul and James Harden on it, they were trying to beat the Golden State Warriors. They're building a team in order to try to beat the Golden State Avengers with KD and Steph and Draymond and Clay and Andre Iguodala and Jesus Christ and Thanos and They went to the conference finals for the first time in Chris Paul's career, but unfortunately, he blew out his hamstring in a series against the Warriors, and they lost in 7 games. After that, Chris Paul and James Harden just couldn't get along. There was even a video where James Harden flicked him off in a press conference, like could not get along. He proved himself so much so at 35 years old, he was traded to a championship contender in the Phoenix Suns when everyone thought he was washed up and couldn't do it. This was one of the hallmark high note moments of Chris Paul's career. He gets traded to the Suns, and they get a little lucky low-key in the playoffs. They beat the Lakers without Anthony Davis. They beat the Nuggets without Jamal Murray. And then they beat the Clippers without Kawhi Leonard, which the Clippers are always without Kawhi Leonard. What's new? They go to the NBA Finals for the first time in Chris Paul's career. I mean, what a Cinderella story. He's aging. Everyone thought it was over for him. He gets traded to a contender, and then they win the championship. Everyone was rooting for him. But Giannis had something to say. And the Milwaukee Bucks beat the Phoenix Suns in the NBA Finals. And Chris Paul said after the game he was addicted to playing in the finals. Next season, the Suns won 64 games, okay? Most in the NBA, right? They are the team everyone's like, they're going to win the finals. They have to. And then they have the most embarrassing playoff loss of all time, I would argue, as far as me watching basketball is concerned. Chris Paul had led the league in assists at 30 million years old. They had the best record in the league. They go and they play the Dallas Mavericks. Let's just say Chris Paul hits a big 3 to cut the lead to 42. They got their ass whooped in Game 7 by the Mavericks. They didn't even try. They could have laid out there and been dead fish. I think they got beat by 33 points. They could have laid out there and been dead fish and did better in the game. I mean, it was terrible. Terrible. Then Chris Paul goes to the Warriors, and at this point, he's just like old. And then he goes to the Spurs to be with Wemby, and then he goes to the Clippers. And he's so happy to be back in LA with the Clippers. He literally cried when they were chanting his name. Like, he really wanted to go and finish his career with the Clippers. He announces that he's retiring, and apparently he keeps telling people what to do, and he can't shut up in meetings. The coach hasn't talked to him in weeks, and he's in Atlanta, which, oh my God, could you imagine getting fired in Atlanta? And I'm from Atlanta. I love my city, but he was probably listening to Big Mama, No Kids in his ear right after getting fired. Like, damn. They call him at 3 o'clock in the morning from their road trip, and they fired him. And now he will retire, I guess, from his couch unless somebody else picks him up. I mean, how unfortunate, right? I think that's disrespectful. I mean, during his farewell tour, that's not right. But it just goes to show you how polarizing he is, because something definitely happened. There was definitely drama, and there was definitely tea, and there's 2 sides to every story there. And he posted on his Instagram story at 3 o'clock in the morning talking about just got sent home. And you know, as a messy bitch myself, it's classic messy bitch behavior to post on a black screen and type your feelings out and post to your story at 3 o'clock in the morning. I'm just saying. Chris Paul might not have ever won a championship, but I think there should be justice for players who don't win championships. I mean, they can't help it. He had some unfortunate luck throughout his career, but he was a great player and he made everyone around him better. And the things that he did just as part of the Players Association and his landmark and his handprint on the game, he deserves to be a Hall of Famer. And I hope that he gets to end his career somewhere, because wow, that was messy. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you learned something and hopefully enjoyed this story. Please let me know in the comments what you want me to talk about next. I'm telling you, you guys, I love when you give me content. I don't be knowing what you want me to talk about. I'd rather talk about something you'd be interested in. Make sure to subscribe here on YouTube and help me keep the lights on in the house, y'all. And on top of that, if you're listening on audio, make sure to subscribe to my podcast and leave me a rating or review. I love you guys. Thank you for watching.